Hey everyone, Genome here with the next episode of Was It Good? Was It Good is pretty much my walk down introspection alley to see if products that I enjoyed back during the period of my youth, and maybe a lot of other people's youth, around the period of the 80s and 90s, if they really hold up. You know, these things can include music, movies, just even pop culture in themselves, and product testing if I can get a hold of some of those great products. So we're going to see if they're any good. So today I'm going to look at a movie from the 80s, and unlike a lot of movies from the 80s, this one gets quite a bit of critical acclaim, though you don't really hear it mentioned much anymore. That movie is Amadeus. Amadeus was released in 1984. This movie was directed by Milos Forman, with the screenplay written and adapted by Peter Shaver, adapted from the play the movie was based on, which was in itself based on the loosely translated events of Mozart's life toward the last few years, specifically, that he was alive. So, this movie, it's pretty hard to say that it wasn't great and doesn't withstand the test of time, seeing as it won 8 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. So, while that doesn't mean a whole lot nowadays, comparatively, at least to some people, it got accolades from his peers at the time, and deservedly so, even though it was up against some pretty stiff competition that year. Where to begin on this? It was acted beautifully. The musical score, I mean, do we really need to say how great the musical score is, seeing as I'd say 9/10 of the music is actually from Mozart himself? So, yeah, needless to say, the soundtrack is going to be great, and what's interesting actually about the soundtrack is how they will blend and make the viewer understand that the music is actually playing in Mozart's head, and when he gets distracted by something, say someone interrupts, the music just stops. And while this was a used trope sometimes in the past, I believe it was perfected in this movie, especially the scenes where he's writing at the billiard table, in the middle of the night by himself, glass of wine by his hand, scribbling furiously on the paper with this quill, and it just works. It works really well. So once again, soundtrack is not to be missed, but neither is his music in general. So let's talk about some of the actors. Salieri, Antonio Salieri that is played by F. Murray Abraham, in a role that kind of put him on the map a little bit, even though how much that translated into the future popularity is kind of called into question, but he is basically the main character of the story. The story is told through his eyes, and that's what makes it also interesting, is the movie called Amadeus, focusing on his music and the events of his life, is actually told through another person's perspective. And we all know how perspective can change depending on who's viewing it. He turns in a very powerful performance. And I actually like him better as the old Salieri, the one that's consigned to the sanitarium in his wheelchair, and he has his gravelly voice now since he tried to cut his throat, and every now and then he'll make this light touch to his throat, which is pretty indicative of how it's hurting him to speak, but he has to speak anyway. At least that's how I view it. In this movie, Mozart is played by Tom Hulce. Tom went on to play a few other roles. I believe the most notable was a small part in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, the 90s remake with Robert De Niro and Kenneth Branagh. He does well with the role. I think he does as well as he could with what he was given. The portrayal of Mozart in this movie is maligned by many, and probably with good reason, because it's hard to believe anyone who grew up as Mozart did, playing in royal courts, playing before the most powerful people in Europe on a regular basis, and his own father was a prominent court composer himself. And it's hard to believe that between the father and all of his life experiences in these performances would not teach him to be a little less socially awkward than they make him out to be in this movie. Yeah, he's very clown and childlike in this movie in some ways, though touching. So you can't really blame any shortcomings on the performance solely on on the actor Tom. He does play well. He's actually, some of the best moments are when he is completely socially awkward, oblivious to what's really going on around him. And he has the endearing relationship with his young wife, Constance, played by Elizabeth Berridge, who does a very good job in her role. From things I've read in the past, she seems pretty close to character, to the real character, that is. So there's that. One interesting note about Tom Hulce in this movie is apparently he didn't play piano before taking this role. The filmmakers could have taken a little shortcut and just played scenes just showing his hands, or they could have used creative angles to where he wasn't really having to play. He would just pantomime playing from, just off frame a little bit. Either the directors or Tom didn't want to do this. They wanted it to be authentic. So Tom basically learned how to play piano for this movie. And if memory serves, he learned it in 8 months, which is pretty astounding considering some of the pieces that he has to play and some of the things he has to do in this movie. Of special note is a scene where they're at a costume party and they pick him up and he's playing suspended in the air. And then they flip him over and he reverses his hands and still plays the piece on the little harpsichord. So it was very impressive, a true indicator of his care for his craft, that he went out to learn that. So kudos to you, Tom, on that one. There's not too many other main characters I want to bring up because basically I would say almost every actor they chose for their roles in this movie was almost perfectly cast. Emperor Joseph was played by Jeffrey Jones. He's been a character actor in many, many movies. You'll see him somewhere. I think I remember him most from Howard the Duck back in the 80s, to be honest with you. But he's been around. I'm not sure he was the perfect choice for that role, because he just doesn't have a gravity to him that you expect from an emperor. He does have it in one scene where he kind of reminds Mozart, "You're nothing but the hired help. Don't ask questions of me, answer what I ask of you." He does that part very well. And the rest of the time, he seems kind of buffoonish a little bit. Apparently, the real Emperor Joseph was a great lover of arts and music, so that part of his character was in keeping. But I'm not sure, other than his physical stature, his imposing height and all that, he was the best cast. And once again, this might be more of writing than it is the fault of the actor, because I've seen him in other things before and he's done pretty well in them. But yeah, he plays Emperor Joseph. A few more actors of note. Simon Callow plays Emmanuel Chicanere. I always pronounce this wrong. I believe it's pronounced Chicanere. He was actually the librettist for The Magic Flute, so it wasn't really fleshed out in the movie. But he was pretty important and instrumental in getting that out, not only being a theater director, but also writing out the libretto for The Magic Flute. So, Leopold Mozart, Mozart's father, is played by Roy Dotrice, and he does pretty well with that. The role probably isn't too demanding of him. He just needs to play stern, rather stone-faced, almost like a mini dictator in his home. And from the biographies I've read of Mozart, that seems to be in keeping with his actual real character. So he does well with it. No complaints there. On a side note, a lot of the extra information I give or comparisons are from a biography I read many years ago by Marcia Davenport. I believe it was published in 1934, thereabouts. It was just simply titled Mozart, and it's a look back basically at his life through letters. She extrapolates basically many different stages of his life from the amount of letters that were sent back and forth between the family members. I encourage all of you to give it a read. It's an excellent read. How historically accurate is it now? I'm not sure. I'm sure there's been quite a few more advances since then, but that was the first and the best one that I had read regarding Mozart. So, and if you do read it, you'll probably notice some similarities between the film Amadeus and what is generally regarded to be Mozart's life. So once again, definitely worth a read and to check it out. As to the movie itself, well, the movie is just a visual masterpiece to look at. If legend is correct, there was no artificial lighting used in this movie, so everything was period-specific lighting, so candlelight, natural lighting, that sort of thing, which is in itself just astounding, especially considering the amount of night shots they do in order for them to get such a beautiful film shot. It's very remarkable that they were able to do it that way. The indoor set pieces. Okay, let's talk about maybe the best part of this movie. I don't know that a more intricate period piece has ever been made, especially as far as the indoor shots. The walls are dripping with details. Everything is ornate. It seems to be cut for the time. Everything is small as door handles being placed higher than what we're used to nowadays. It's just incredible. The amount of detail and artwork in this movie is just beyond belief. I think my favorite one is the drawing room that Mozart first meets Emperor Joseph in, when he's coming in and Joseph is just talking away at the harpsichord and really butchering the march that Salieri wrote for Mozart's arrival. And there's just these huge canvas paintings on the wall, and just every candlestick is perfect. Every desk carving is just, I hate to keep using the word perfect, but it just fits, it just works. And the attention to detail is one of the things that just makes this movie so great. And I know it won it some awards, and very, very deservingly so. So, as far as set pieces go, I can't really think of a better one that I've ever seen as far as accuracy and attention to details go. As to the movie itself, while they were great scenes, I believe there was a little too much focus on the opera scenes in this movie. And this happens especially towards the latter part of the movie. You'll have 20 minutes of Don Giovanni or 20 minutes of the Magic Flute. Don't get me wrong, these scenes are great. I mean, they nailed it, and you couldn't find an opera so well done now. But I would like to have seen a little more of the day-to-day from Mozart. His, I don't want to say behind the scenes, but more of him learning the hard way of where he really fit into that society. The society that he lived in was so much of a rigid caste system that he thought he had elevated himself above where he really was in his station in life. And toward the end of the movie, you can tell he's kind of getting the idea. It's like, okay, between court intrigue and me not having artistic license, maybe I should have learned to be a much more graceful in my handling of social situations, and I would be appointed to a nice soft post. Look at Joseph Haydn. Joseph Haydn stayed in, I believe it's with the Habsburgs, in their service as a court composer for like 40 years. He had free reign over their orchestra. He got paid handsomely. He was treated very well. You know, he was feted about all over Europe. And he was a good friend of Mozart's as well. And also my favorite composer, by the way. Just thought I'd throw that in there. But Mozart didn't have any of that because he was reluctant to compromise. And, you know, pride goes before the fall, they say. And, well, he didn't get that until much later. Now, whether this is in keeping with his real life or just in biographies and movies, who's to know? But in any case, I would like to have seen more interaction between Mozart and the court intrigue that was going on at the time. And while they show a good deal of footage from The Marriage of Figaro and Don Giovanni, they don't actually make any mention of Lorenzo da Ponte. Lorenzo da Ponte is a librettist who wrote the librettos for basically Mozart's two biggest operas. And there's no real mention made of it, which is kind of surprising, seeing as how prominent that pairing was. They wrote a lot of operas together, and basically he had his hand in two of the biggest ones, the most famous ones ever written, and there's no mention given to him. Now, I know you get into these instances where you can just start rattling off names that are somewhat important and it just gets to be too wieldy. Take Lord of the Rings, for example. They had to make some cuts there because there's so much lore and so much history in the books that you just can't fit it all in a movie that's 2 to 3 hours. It's just not going to happen. So I can understand that, but maybe just take out a few minutes of some of the operas and show them meeting, talking, getting fired up over this new book that's written, or this new poem that's written, and then him starting to pencil down words and Mozart putting music to these words. I think that would have been a little more humanizing and shown him as not just a gifted savant in the fact that he was good at music and nothing else. I mean, he was obviously very good at making friends, and he apparently, from what I read, he was a social butterfly. He was always going out, go to parties, out with friends and doing activities out in the countryside. So I think it would have been nice to see a little more of that piece of him rather than just the opera scenes. And like I said, I'll say again, they're good, but they can drag a little bit, especially if you're not a big fan of opera. Now, I'm not a huge fan of opera. I like more instrumental pieces and less voice, but you know, that's to each their own. I believe opera was Mozart's favorite musical form, so who am I to say what's right? But anyway, so that's kind of the take on that. The scenes of the mysterious man in black who gave Mozart the commission for the Requiem Mass, which he was writing upon his death in real life, that seems to have some basis in historical accuracy, though how much it had to do with his death is open to debate. They do weave, especially towards the end, they do weave the Requiem Mass into quite a bit of the last few minutes of the film, wherein Mozart's obviously declining rapidly, which is a very good touch. I do like the last scenes where Salieri is assisting Mozart, basically as a dictation machine, and at some point he can't even really comprehend what Mozart is talking about, which is probably a little far-fetched considering how musically accomplished he was. But as far as making quality music, Mozart was just light years ahead of the guy. You never hear anything from Salieri, and Mozart is known by people who don't know anything about music. But the scene's kind of touching, and in it, F. Murray Abraham seems to portray that he's feeling some regret at this point. He's realized that he set in motion events that maybe he shouldn't have. But it's too late to stop it, and he has to continue on. So I can't really tell if it's a nuance on the actor's part or how it was written, whether he felt remorse at that point or he was still just trying to get that Requiem out of him for his own grandeur. At any rate, this review is getting kind of long, so I guess down to the review itself. Was Amadeus any good? Watch this movie. I don't think any more needs to be said about this. Just go out and watch this movie. Rent it, download it, do what you have to do. Go see it. You don't have to be a fan of classical music. I will say that it helps quite a bit because the soundtrack is basically all classical. They're going to talk about musical themes. They don't get too in-depth. They won't be sitting and reading sheet music to you and going over scales. But it would definitely help your enjoyment of it, especially if you're a fan of his music. Which, if you are, I'm sure you've already seen this movie anyway, so my point is rather moot. But even if you're not, the movie is just, it's a visual treat to look at. It's well written, well acted. Pacing is a little slow at times, but I think, especially in the scenes in court, are perfectly done. And if nothing else, if you wanted to see an eye for detail that you'll never probably see again in any other movie, look at this movie for that. And before I close, I just wanted to show you an old buddy of mine. I've had him for, I don't know how many years, but he goes with me wherever I am. And, Mozart has been a big part of my life for, I'd say, the last 20 years. So that might once again taint my reviews a little bit. But at the same time, seeing as the character in the movie may be so far removed from the actual character, maybe there's no actual bias here to worry about, because I'd be more inclined to be biased against the movie because of the inaccurate portrayal. Let's just take the movie for what it is. It's an achievement that you'll probably never see again in film. So while not my favorite movie all time, it's definitely top 10, And fun fact, it was the very first DVD I ever owned, back when DVDs came out. In fact, the copy I have is two-sided, so that either shows how old the movie is or how old I am. So in any case, thanks for watching. If you have any comments, questions, concerns, think I'm a genius, think I'm an idiot, please put it down there in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see y'all for the next episode of Was It Good? Thanks again. Genome out.